I'm going to give you a preview, and this is going to be for everybody's benefit. Just base, you guys know what Ruth is about, right? But we're going to cover a little preview of the book of Ruth, just in case there's anybody here who is not too familiar. But at the same time, I'm going to throw in a couple of things in there that might be new, even if you are familiar with the book of Ruth. And this is just a preliminary preview of what we're going to read in the next four chapters. Okay? Now, like I said before, in many respects, Ruth is the ultimate love story. It is a love story on several levels. It's a love story because Ruth falls in love with Boaz, right? That's the main plot line. We know that. But overlaying that is the ultimate love story, a love story written in blood on a wooden cross, erected in Judea 2,000 years ago. Now, Ruth is one of the most significant books in the Old Testament for the church. And it's interesting that the book is traditionally read by rabbis on the feast of Pentecost, the very feast day upon which the church was born. It explains, like no other book in the scripture, the role and mission of a person named the kinsman redeemer. Now, many people believe that this book is an essential prerequisite to understanding the book of Revelation. Let me explain. Before you study Revelation chapter 5, you need to understand the book of Ruth. So, chapter 1 is what you will call love's resolve. That's where Ruth cleaves to Naomi. Chapter 2 is love's response. Ruth's gleaning, right? We'll cover that. Chapter 3 is love's request. It's actually a very pivotal threshing floor scene. Chapter 4 is love's reward, the redemption of both the land for Naomi and a bride for Boaz. So, just to preview, like I told you, chapter 1, we're going to begin in the days the judges ruled. So, in other words, famine drove a family to Moab from Bethlehem. Elimelech, which means God is my king, and his wife Naomi, which means pleasant, lived in Bethlehem. Because of a serious famine, they moved to Moab along with their two sons, Malon, which Hebrew for unhealthy, and Kilion, which has a couple of different definitions, puny and also pining. When you miss something so badly. The sons marry, but within 10 years, all the men are dead. Malon, Chilion, and Elimelech. So they leave Naomi destitute, all alone. So during those 10 years, things began looking better back in Bethlehem. This was not a regular famine, by the way. It was because of the Midianites. We just read about that a few chapters ago. We'll touch upon that a little more because some people feel that there was a famine because of the weather, it wouldn't rain and this. But then again, why would it not affect Moab? Moab was just about 50 to 100 miles away only. So that's what it makes sense to understand that the famine that was plaguing Bethlehem was because of the Midianites. It was nothing to do with rain or agricultural downfall, nothing like that at all. So, anyways, so during those 10 years, things began looking better back in Bethlehem. So Naomi decided to go back home, right? Sounds good. So she released her two daughters in law from any obligations to her and actually encouraged them to find new husbands since they were young and they were from Moab, they were Moabites. So she urged the daughters in law not to follow her. And one of them, Orpah, ultimately decided to stay with her people in Moab. But Ruth, which means desirable, remained with Naomi. In fact, her commitment is one of the most famous passages in the Bible. Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after you, for where you go, I will go." Let me turn my notes here. So, where you lodge, I will lodge. In other words, where you live, I'll live with you. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do to me, and more also, if aught death part thee and me. So, in other words, she said this to her widowed mother in law. It was impressive. She was a very, very impressive person. Then we're going to go to chapter 2, and then we'll start reading. Now, in chapter 2, Ruth is gleaning. I use that term sometimes. What can you glean out of the study today? What can you glean? That means what can you gather? What can you learn? What can you pick from what I'm sharing with you, right? That's called gleaning. We're going to read about where in the scriptures it talks about that more in depth. One of the values of the book is that to understand it, you have to do a little homework about the law of gleaning and the law of the levirate marriage. Those two things are going to be very important in the book of Ruth. But don't worry, I got your back. I'll discuss and I'll explain those things when we get to them. Now, for example, the law of gleaning was a form of welfare. If you owned a field, your reapers, your harvesters, in other words, could go through the field once and only once. Whatever they missed was left for widows, the poor, the orphans, etc. In her gleaning, Ruth happened upon a field of Boaz, which means in him is strength. That's the Hebrew word for Boaz. One of the wealthiest landowners in the area, by the way. He was probably the primary leader among the men at the gate. He was introduced to Ruth by an unnamed servant. She obviously caught his eye because he instructed his supervisors not to let the young men touch her, and he gave her protection. He also instructed them to drop handfuls of grain on purpose. So it so happened that Boaz was a kinsman for Naomi's family, which is why this is important to us. The law of redemption said when someone sold their property, they actually sold only the rights to the property, not the title. Why? Because a title belonged to God. If you died, a kinsman of your family could go and pay the money to redeem the land. Naomi had sold her property 10 years before. Now they were back. But as she was destitute and could not buy it back, a kinsman of hers would have the right to purchase that land from whoever was using it. The law of redemption, by the way, is in Leviticus 25. There is also something called the law of the levirate marriage. If you were a widow without issue, you could ask your nearest kinsman to raise up issue with you. He didn't have to, but if he did, it would continue the line, the family line. That is in Deuteronomy 25. So I'm not going to recap 3 and 4 because what's the point? But I just wanted to give you a little preview of what is going on here. Okay. Now, one thing about Boaz. Remember I mentioned kinsman redeemer? Uh, like I said, Boaz is the only person who is in a position to save Ruth and Naomi from a life of poverty and disgrace. Out of the goodness of his heart, he takes the actions necessary within the ancient Hebrew code to make them part of his own family and elevate them to a position of respect and honor. Now, here's a little bit of symbolism. Boaz makes a perfect foreshadow of the character of the Lord Jesus Christ that's displayed in the New Testament. We and the entire human race are helpless in our personal struggle against sin. In kindness and compassion, Jesus did what was necessary to make us part of his own family, even though it meant he had to suffer and die to bring it about. So, because of his efforts in our behalf, we can be lifted out of our shame and be given all the benefits that belong to royalty. These blessings can be ours by acknowledging and personally accepting his offer of rescue and relief. Okay, so let's see. Here we go. Chapter 1, the book of Ruth. Long ago, in the days before Israel had a king, there was a famine in the land. So a man named Elimelech, who belonged to the clan of Ephrath and who lived in Bethlehem in Judah, went with his wife Naomi and their two sons, Malon and Kilion, to live for a while in the country of Moab. While they were there, living there, Elimelech died, and Naomi was left alone with her two sons, who married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. So the story of Ruth takes place sometime during the period of the rule of the judges. Now, these were dark days for Israel when all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Judges 17 and Judges 21. But during those dark and evil times, some still followed God. Naomi and Ruth are extraordinary examples of loyalty, friendship, and commitment to God and to each other. Now, as far as Moab, the land east of the Dead Sea, was one of the nations that oppressed the Israelites during the period of Judges, in Judges chapter 3. So the two nations were actually hostile to each other. The famine must have been quite severe for in Israel for Elimelech to move his family there. Even, even if Israel had already defeated Moab, relations still would have been very tense between them. Elimelech and his family were called Ephrathites because Ephrath was an earlier name for Bethlehem, in case you guys were wondering. Now, let's talk about the famine. Remember I told you a little while ago? This is the famine mentioned here could very well be been in the period of intense impoverishment brought on by the Midianite invasion of Israel. So, like a cloud of grasshoppers, the Midianites swarmed over all available crops, feeding their cattle and voraciously grabbing up any edible produce before the Israelites could even touch the fruit of their labor. This would explain why Moab did not suffer any loss of harvest and why Elimelech would see this move as advantageous for his family. Remember the story of Gideon? That Gideon was so afraid of the marauders that he actually was threshing wheat inside a wine press where there was hardly any wind, which defeats the purpose of threshing the wheat. But that's how bad things were back then. Now, as far as when it says here that Elimelech, Malon, and Kilion, all three of them passed away, right? So that would leave Naomi as a widow. This is important because a widow's misfortune in this time and culture was serious indeed. She would have no means of securing an income and little access to food. Without anyone to take her in, she would be at the mercy of her creditors. In the face of such a bad circumstance, God Himself offers to defend the widows and later asks the church to take on the responsibility of looking after them. Okay, let's go on here. Let's go back to 3. Elimelech died, and Naomi was left alone with her two sons, who married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. About 10 years later, Malon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left all alone, without husband or sons. 6. Sometime later, Naomi heard that the Lord had blessed his people by giving them good crops. So she got ready to leave Moab with her daughters in law. They started out together to go back to Judah, but on the way, she said to them, "Go back home and stay with your mothers. May the Lord be as good to you as you have been to me and to those who have died. And may the Lord make it possible for each of you to marry again and have a home." So Naomi kissed them goodbye, but they started crying. 10. And said to her, "No, we will go with you to your people." So We have a very, very interesting situation going on here. Friendly relations with the Moabites were very, very, very discouraged. Deuteronomy 23, by the way, but probably not forbidden, since the Moabites lived outside the promised land. Marrying a Canaanite or the other peoples living within the borders of the promised land, however, was against God's law. Moabites were not allowed to worship at the tabernacle because they had not let the Israelites pass through their land during the exodus from Egypt. As God's chosen people, though, the Israelites should have set an example to the other nations of living holy lives. Ironically, however, God used Ruth, a Moabite woman, as an example of genuine spiritual character. This shows just how bleak, how horrible life had become in Israel during those days. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah, one more. In the ancient world, by the way, almost nothing was worse than being a widow. We covered that a little while ago, but a little bit more. These women were taken advantage of or ignored, and they were almost always poverty stricken. So, as we know, God's law provided that the nearest relative of a woman's dead husband should care for his widow. But Naomi had no relatives in Moab, and so she did not know if any of her relatives were still alive in Israel. Let's continue here with 11. Let's see, yes, you must go back, my daughters. Naomi answered, why do you want to come with me? Do you think I could have sons again for you to marry? Go back home, for I'm too old to get married again. Even I Even if I thought there was still hope and so got married tonight and had sons, would you wait until they had grown up? Would this keep you from marrying someone else? No, my daughters, you know that's impossible. The Lord has turned against me, and I feel very sorry for you. So we have a, hold on a second here. Now, Naomi's comment here, can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? Refers to what we talked about briefly, a levirate marriage, the obligation of a dead man's brother to care for his widow. Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10, by the way. This law kept widows from poverty and provided a way for the family's name of a dead husband to continue. Now, because Naomi had no other sons for Ruth and Orpah to marry, she encouraged them to remain in their homeland and remarry other men. Orpah agreed, which was her right, but Ruth was willing to give up the possibility of security and children in order to care for Naomi, which was a very, very nice thing and very nice gesture. 14. Again, they started crying. Then Orpah kissed her mother in law goodbye and went back home. But Ruth held on to her. So Naomi said to her, Ruth, your sister in law has gone back to her people and to her God. Go back home with her. So, although Orpah is finally convinced to return home, Ruth clings to Naomi. That's the word that they use. She clung to Naomi, like hugging. She did not want to let go. Now, the word for cling in the original means to stick or to adhere, like tape. The noun form is the word for glue. But Naomi continues her pitch, trying to influence Ruth to return to her people and her false gods. This encouragement hardly seems like the message a godly woman ought to be promoting to a young, easily influenced protege. But Naomi is in her own grief, is not thinking straight at this point. Let's see here. Let's continue here. But Ruth answered, don't ask me to leave you. Let me go with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Where for your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and that is where I will be buried. May the Lord's worst punishment come upon me if I let anything but death separate me from you. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. Ruth was a Moabite woman, but that didn't stop her from worshiping the true God, nor did it stop God from accepting her worship and blessing her greatly. The Israelites were not the only people God loved. God had chosen the Israelites to be the people through whom the rest of the world would come to know him. So this was fulfilled when Jesus Christ was born as a Jew. Through him, the entire world came to know God. In Acts chapter 10, it says that in every nation he accepts those who fear him and do what is right. God accepts all who worship him. He works through people regardless of their race, their sex, or their status. The book of Ruth is a perfect example of God's impartiality. Although Ruth belonged to a people often despised by Israel, she was blessed because of her faithfulness. She became a great grandmother of King David and a direct ancestor of Jesus. No one should feel disqualified to serve God, and God can use every circumstance to build his kingdom. Okay. 19. They went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived, the whole town became excited, and the women there exclaimed, "Is this really Naomi?" So, the journey from Moab to Bethlehem, I have a little map I want to show you right now. Let me tell you something interesting about this. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem had to be extremely difficult for the two women. First, they would have traveled north, for example. They could have gone south or north, but if they went north, just for example, they would have traveled on the upper end of the Dead Sea. Then, to cross over the Jordan, they would have had to descend from a relative high elevation of 1,290 feet below sea level, where the Jordan River enters the Dead Sea. After making their way across the river, they will begin their ascent through rugged terrain, about 25 miles as the crow flies, as they say, to reach Bethlehem. Bethlehem was 2,300 feet above sea level. So you're talking from 1,290 feet below sea level to 2,300 feet above is almost a mile, up and down, let alone going through the rugged terrain. So let me show you a little. Okay, so here we have a map, right? This is Bethlehem over here. This is Bethlehem. This is where they started from and where they went back to. Now, this is the land of Moab. It's not very
disconnected. Bluetooth connected.
It's not very clear where exactly in Moab they were living for those 10 years. Nobody really knows exactly what part of Moab, but it was in this area. So they could have gone south around the Dead Sea and then upwards over here, but there's a lot of rugged terrain over here. They could have gone across, but there's a body of water over here, which sometimes in some parts of the year it's not too deep. You can kind of wade through it. More than likely, they went up like this. It's easier for them to travel this way, even though as the crow flies is about the same distance. But so, some people feel they went north, some people feel they went south, but either way, there's a lot of mountains on both areas. So that's how far they travel from here. Well, first from Bethlehem, to get away from the famine, they went over here, across the Dead Sea. After the 10 years, When they heard that Bethlehem was having good crops again, they went back that way. Just to let you know what it looks like, kind of. So here we go. Verse 20. Do not call me Naomi, she answered. Call me Mara, because Almighty God has made my life bitter. When I left here, I had plenty, but the Lord has brought me back without a thing. Why call me Naomi when the Lord Almighty has condemned me and set me in trouble? Remember that Naomi meant pleasant. And so she said, don't call me pleasant. I'm not pleasant anymore. I'm bitter. So call me Mara, which means bitter, by the way. Remember the bitter waters that Moses dealt with people in the wilderness? Mara. So Mara means bitter. So here we have Naomi and Ruth coming back home, right, to Bethlehem. Nobody really made a big deal about it except the ladies. They like to talk among themselves and gossip. Is this really Naomi? Is that Naomi who left many years ago? And then that's when Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because Almighty God has made my life bitter. This then was how Naomi came back from Moab with Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the barley harvest was just beginning. So Naomi had experienced severe hardships. She had left Israel married, the mother of two sons, and secure, right? She returned widowed, childless, and poor. Naomi changed her name to express the bitterness and pain that she actually felt. Naomi was not rejecting
Bluetooth disconnected. Bluetooth connected.
Naomi was not rejecting God by openly expressing her pain. However, she seems to have lost sight of the tremendous resources she had in her relationship with Ruth and with God. 22. This then was how Naomi came back from Moab with Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the barley harvest was just beginning. So Bethlehem was about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. The town was surrounded by very lush fields and olive groves. Its harvests were abundant. Ruth is an ancestor of both David and Jesus. Ruth and Naomi's return to Bethlehem was certainly part of God's plan. In this town, David would be born. Bethlehem, remember? Son of Jesse in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And as predicted by the prophet Micah, so would Jesus Christ. Micah chapter 5 verse 2 says that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. So this move then was more than merely convenient for Ruth and Naomi. It led to the fulfillment of God's promises. Now, because Israel's climate is quite moderate, each year had two harvests, in the spring and in the fall. The barley harvest took place in the spring, and it was during this time of hope and plenty that
Bluetooth disconnected.
that
Bluetooth
Ruth that,
connected.
that Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a farming community, and because it was a time of the harvest, plenty of leftover grain was in the fields. This grain could be collected or gleaned, we talked about this earlier, and then made into food. Okay, so let me see. There's something, a little story. It's not really a story.
Bluetooth connected.
It's just a paragraph. There's a writer named Max Lucado. Max Lucado. He had a very interesting quote when it comes to the life of Naomi and Ruth, and I'm going to read it to you right now. And I'm quoting Max Lucado, okay? This reminds me of the often told story of two maestros who attended a concert to hear a promising young soprano singing. One commented on the purity of her voice. The other responded, yes, but she will sing better once her heart is broken. So, in other words, there are certain passions that are only learned by pain. And there are times when God, knowing that, allows us to endure the pain for the sake of the song, if you will, for lack of a better term. Okay, let's see here. Let's let's start. I think we can do about, we'll see what we can do as far as chapter 2. I know we're not going to be able to finish all of it, but let's do as much as we can. Ruth works in the field of Boaz. Excuse me. Naomi had a relative named Boaz, a rich and influential man who belonged to the family of her husband Elimelech. One day, Ruth said to Naomi, Let me go, let me go to the fields to gather the grain that the harvest workers leave. I'm sure to find someone who will let me work with them. Naomi answered, Go ahead, daughter. So Ruth went out to the fields and walked behind the workers, picking up the heads of grain which they left. It so happened that she was in the field that belonged to Boaz. You see how beautiful God works? You know, Ruth did not know which field would belong to Boaz, who was Elimelech's relative. But it's so beautiful the way God's providence takes care of everything in people's lives. So, sometime later, Boaz himself arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the workers. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, they answered. Again, we notice here the character of Boaz. He's a godly man. Remember, don't forget, in those days, Israel was in dire straits. A lot of them did not believe in the God, the real God of Israel. A lot of them worship other false gods, right? But here we have a guy named Boaz who happened to be a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, right? And so it's so beautiful, beautiful. The way I see it is so beautiful the way that God somehow, you know, guides Ruth to end up in this field that actually belonged to Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi, basically. And also at the same time, Boaz was a man of God. The Lord is be with you. And his workers even respected him. The Lord bless you, they answered. So gleaning, a little bit about gleaning. I've kind of mentioned this before. It is in Leviticus 19, verse
Bluetooth
9.
disconnect. Bluetooth connected.
Gleaning was one of God's provisions for the poor. Real simple as that. Landowners were instructed by law not to reap to the edges of their property and not to go a second time over the fields to pick up what was accidentally overlooked in the first pass. Now, in spite of God's express wishes, however, the farmers were not always cooperative, wanting to squeeze the most profit out of every inch of land. That is why Ruth articulated a desire to find a landowner that was favorable toward her. Okay, let's go a little further. 4. Oh, we got this already. Sometime later, Boaz himself arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the workers. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the man in charge, Who is that young woman? The man answered, She is the foreigner who came back from Moab with Naomi. She asked me to let her follow the workers and gather grain. She has been working since early morning and has just now stopped to rest for a while under the shelter. Now, Ruth's first glimpse of Boaz occurs as he salutes the field workers in the name of the Lord. From this, she will be able to see his devotion to God, as well as the people's affection towards him as they returned his greeting. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's continue. Then Boaz said to Ruth, Let me give you some advice. Do not gather grain anywhere. except in this field. Work with the women here. Watch them to see where they are reaping and stay with them. I have ordered my men not to bother you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and drink from the water jars that they have filled. Ruth bowed down with her face touching the ground and said to Boaz, "Why should you be so concerned about me? Why should you be so kind to a foreigner?" Boaz answered, "I have heard about everything that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband died. I know how you left your father and mother and your own country, and how you came to live among a people you have never known before. May the Lord reward you for what you have done. May you have a full reward from the Lord, God of Israel, to whom you have come for protection." So let's see here. Ruth's task, although it was very menial, tiring, and perhaps degrading, was done faithfully. Very, very simple. Now, Ruth took the initiative to provide for herself and Naomi. Even though the situation could have been dangerous, there are times when tough work with little rest is our only option. Boaz noticed Ruth's tenacity. In fact, he was so impressed with Ruth that he let her follow directly behind his harvesters in order to pick up the choicest grain that they dropped. Ruth probably chose this field to gather grain randomly, but God knew exactly which field would lead her to cross paths with Boaz. And Ruth had to do her part as well. Had she considered herself too proud or embarrassed to work in the fields, accepting the charity of someone else, she would have missed the opportunity to meet Boaz, which would change her life and give her the honor of becoming the ancestor of a king, King David, and the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Then we have Ruth. Ruth's life exhibited admirable qualities. She was hardworking, she was loving, she was kind, she was faithful, she was brave. These qualities gained for her a good reputation because she displayed them consistently in all areas of her life. Her past actions were a report card by which
Bluetooth
others
disconnected.
judged
Bluetooth
her.
connected.
Wherever Ruth went or whatever she did, her character remained the same. Ruth's reputation was one of her most valuable assets. Our reputations are formed by our actions, and particularly by how we treat other people. Those who watch you at work, those who watch you in public, at home, or at church will notice the nature of your true character. Good character comes by consistently living out the truth that God reveals in His Word, no matter who we are or where we are. Okay. Ruth answered, "You are very kind to me, sir. You have made me feel better by speaking gently to me, even though I am not the equal of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to Ruth, "Come, have a piece of bread and dip it in the sauce." So she sat with the workers, and Boaz passed some roasted grain to her. She ate until she was satisfied, and she still had some food left over. After she had left to go and gather grain, Boaz ordered the workers, "Let her gather grain even where the bundles are lying, and do not say anything to stop her. Besides that, pull out some heads of grain from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up." So Ruth gathered grain in the fields until evening, and when she had beaten it out, she found she had nearly 25 pounds. She took the grain back into town and showed her mother-in-law how much she had gathered. She also gave her the food left over from the meal. Naomi asked her, "Where did you gather all this grain today?
Bluetooth connected.
Whose field have you been working in? May God bless the man who took an interest in you." So Ruth told Naomi that she had been working in a field belonging to a man named Boaz. "May the Lord bless Boaz," Naomi exclaimed. "The Lord always keeps his promises to the living and the dead." And she went on, "That man is a close relative of ours, one of those responsible for taking care of us." Then Ruth said, "Best of all, he told me to keep gathering grain with his workers until they finish the harvest." Naomi said to Ruth, "Yes, daughter, it'll be better for you to work with the women in Boaz's field. You might be bothered if you went to someone else's field." So Ruth worked with them and gathered grain
Bluetooth connected.
until all the barley and wheat had been harvested, and she continued to live with her mother in law. So, the people in the book of Ruth are classic examples of the godly in action. Boaz went far beyond the intent of the gleaner's law in demonstrating his kindness and generosity. He not only let Ruth glean in his field, but also told his workers to purposely let some of the grain fall in her path. Out of his abundance, he provided for Ruth and Naomi's need. Then we have Naomi had felt bitter about her predicament, remember? But her faith in God was still alive, and she praised God for Boaz's kindness to Ruth. In her sorrow, she still trusted God and acknowledged his goodness. Now, though Ruth may not have always recognized God's guidance, he had been with her every step of the way. She went to glean and just happened to end up in the field owned by Boaz, who just happened to be a close relative. This was more than mere coincidence as you go about your daily task. God is working in your life in ways you may not even notice. So the imagery that Boaz chose to illustrate God's watch care over Ruth relegates to God the characteristics of a bird. So, what? Let me explain. God does not actually possess a pair of wings
Bluetooth disconnected. Bluetooth connected.
that he uses to fly about in the universe or under which he can place those he desires to shelter or protect. But the example brings to mind a beautiful picture of a nurturing parent bird wanting to offer security and comfort to its frightened little birds that is not quite ready to make it on their own yet. This same level of care is
Bluetooth
spoken
disconnected. Bluetooth connected.
this same level of care is spoken of in other places in scripture as being available to us as well. So let's see here. Yeah, as far as places in the Bible where the God is pictured protecting us like a bird covering with his wing, his little bird, baby birds. You can find this in Psalm 36, verse 7, and of course, of all places, Psalm 91. And then, so finally, it was abnormal for the gleaners to follow too closely on the heels of the harvesters. Unwritten etiquette required that they stay a very appropriate distance until it was obvious that the workers were completely done. But Boaz wants Ruth to get first pickings, and then he bends the rules even further. He asks his laborers to deliberately leave extra stalks of grain for Ruth to find. It's a very, very beautiful picture. Think about that for a second. So that's what it is. That's what it is. I think we're done with chapter 2. I have some more notes about the kinsman redeemer, but I think we're going to use that tomorrow to recap. Okay, let's put this over here.